That's where that begins. Suppose a being attains liberation during his life. Where does he go? Or in what state would it be after dying? If one becomes free from suffering in this lifetime and dies, that is it. We cannot know the answer to that question specifically, because if we had experienced parinibbana, that is full enlightenment, and the cessation of rebirth into samsara, we would not be here to speak of it. And also, it is unspeakable in that we can only speak of what the afterlife isn't. It isn't so much an afterlife, it isn't in a state anywhere. Where is it? It isn't. It is not part of conditioned things. The expression of deathless is that we are no longer born into the realms, whether they be heavenly, hell-like, or animal or human, where one is surrounded by and is of a conditioned nature, put together, made of elements, and therefore subject to the characteristics of existence, life, anicca, impermanence, dukkha, suffering, and anatta, not a self, but also not within our control, just a result of these conditioned things, impermanent things. All conditioned things are impermanent, unsatisfactory, and not self, out of our control. Now, at liberation, in the sense we use the word in the context of Buddhism, the Buddha was a fully enlightened and awakened being whom shared the Dharma with ourselves for 45 years until his final parinibbana, after which there isn't a place where that individual has gone, that physical body, which also suffered during his lifetime with many ailments. He taught for many years, as I say, 45, walking all over very rough terrain in northeast India, living in harsh conditions a lot of the time, working very hard, teaching the Dharma after his enlightenment out of compassion to share with others, not the experience of what comes next, but what we are doing now to be free from further suffering next, or rebirth. Now, one can even separate part of that from the context of rebirth and see the momentary rebirths within our own lifetimes, where things change and are not consistent by the nature of their conditioned existence being impermanent. Where we live, what we do, whom we're with. None of these things, even within this lifetime, are permanent, continually changing as we are to adapt to the conditions and circumstances we are surrounded by. So this is a question commonly asked. So where did the Buddha go? And you then go on to say, where is the Buddha now? That he is no longer alive as a human. Oh, so where is the Buddha now that he is no longer alive as a human, and why should I strive to reach him? No, you're not striving to reach him. He's not asking you to come and sit on his right palm or on his right side or live with him in heaven. No. The Buddha is teaching us in the Dharma how to live now, in the present moment. Now, all I can share with you here in these talks is also my experience from the understanding I have of the Dharma, the teachings of the Buddha, of living in a way to try and attain contentment. That is, a degree of satisfaction with as little as possible, in order to try and arrive at our conclusion, which is the end of suffering, to be free from suffering within this lifetime. The Buddha taught this, the Four Noble Truths. There is suffering, a cause of suffering, a path leading to the end of suffering. After a cause of suffering, an end of suffering, and the path leading to the end of suffering. It is the cause of suffering that we are identifying in order to eradicate it, and therefore be free from suffering, nirodha, the end of suffering. And the way we do that is by following the fourth noble truth, the Noble Eightfold Path, the practice of moral virtue, of meditation, and the development of wisdom. This is the basis of which, this Noble Eightfold Path, they're not steps, but four of its categories are based on moral virtue, on goodness, on doing no harm, either to ourselves or to others. That we have as the 5 precepts: no killing, no stealing, no sexual misconduct, lying, or the taking of intoxicants. So just by that alone, we're covering a large percentage of the Noble Eightfold Path. In other words, what the Buddha has taught us to do, to not be with him, but like him, also awakened, also to attain to parinibbana, final awakening and liberation from rebirth, the deathless. But what that is cannot be told, cannot be explained. Of whatever faith you may have, in whatever religion, from whatever culture, there is no actual fact, evidence of an individual who can prove to you unequivocally this is what happens after death. Now, there are many stories and probably very accurate recollections of near-death experiences. But likewise, similar experiences can be experienced when not near to death, through deep states of samadhi, absorbed concentrated meditation, where one might get a glimpse, for example, of one's previous lives, or even some insight into the nature of liberation through a disconnect, not being so attached to the body, thought phenomena, all of these phenomena. And near-death experiences, these too, can often, I think, represent, especially as the body and the thinking brain is undergoing immense duress, and under this stress shutting down and into a dreamlike state, going to experience phenomena that we can equate to dreaming. But if someone actually is clinically dead, died, and that body, physical body, that thinking brain, is no longer able to be resuscitated in any way, it won't be. And then that what was, that person, that amalgamation of conditioned things, just 4 elements, solidity, liquidity, gaseousness, temperature, or earth, water, wind, fire, along with space, and even awareness, consciousness in terms of knowing via the thinking brain, through experience of seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting and touching, all of that is finished, gone, switched off. And being as it's unable to be resuscitated, cannot come back and then tell anybody what happened, what's next. If they do, they haven't died, have they? I know near-death experience, but it's near, not there. Now, there are many tales, many stories, again, factual, good recollections of these events from monks also in deep states of samadhi and meditation. But again, you would have to understand or listen to somebody else's recollection and believe it. You cannot know it until you experience it yourself. And this is the Dharma. This is what the Buddha teaches us. To go and practice and experience it for yourself. So if I take this question, you're losing the appeal of the goal. Because this state of liberation seems less appealing relating it to blood and flesh. Not quite sure I understand I missed a bit there. I can't imagine this state. No, so don't try and imagine. This would just be that, imagination. We can't even imagine. We can imagine, but it doesn't mean it is so. The next moment, what's happening next in our day? I mean, based on recollection of past experience, we can have some idea, but we cannot be sure. This is anicca, uncertainty. So we must never lose sight of this wisdom. Right view is the singular aspect of the Noble Eightfold Path, but the most important. Right view, samadhi, it begins with, but also concludes with, because it is establishing this right view as in the characteristics of existence, impermanence, unsatisfactoriness, and not self, that has to be applied to everything, including knowing our imagination is just that. All that is happening in the present moment, here and now, is what we know. Everything else is memory in the past that we cannot be sure of. Our memory is subject to failings, to fault. It isn't 100% accurate all of the time. But it's still gone, has been, it is past. So irrelevant. Nothing we can do to change it. And as for the next moment, it is the future. It is purely imagination. A lot of these experiences, I know in this question you're not asking of that. I'm coming to that in a minute. The next question, if I just find the long one and I can take bits from it, is asking a little bit more about these near-death experiences when people are talking about floating upwards, tunnels of light, into heavenly realms, dragged downwards into hell, and equating that with some of the stories in the suttas of the Buddha, of Moggallana, so highly attained beings in their time, monks, enlightened beings, and their practice and their descriptions of their experiences of these realms. That cannot be equated with belief systems and near-death experiences based on doctrinal belief systems, for instance. One may have been brought up in an environment culturally whereby you believe in a God, in heaven, in hell, white light and heaven, fire and brimstone hell. And naturally speaking, as you come towards your death, you could well experience phenomena pictorially and even feeling, but especially emotionally, of what you have been indoctrinated with throughout your lives, as it could be the case culturally with all religious beliefs. But the emphasis has to be on the word beliefs. What the Buddha is describing, and Moggallana, which is quite different perhaps from a near-death experience, but in some ways could be similar, is their actual experience, because as enlightened beings in meditation, they can recount, remember their past lives. Now, they are not saying, however, that we should believe in any of those sutras that this is the way it is. They are still saying practice the Noble Eightfold Path and experience it for yourself. They are merely giving us a pictorial guide representing from their experience what they have experienced, but still within the realms of samsara, rebirth. That is, not necessarily being born into the human realm, where we are present, and where we have access to listen to and learn and understand the teachings of the Buddha, and also with the suffering that there is, great incentive to be free from that. Even born into the heavenly realms, we are still reborn. And this again is impermanent, or the hell realms. We, if we haven't been there, cannot remember them ourselves through our own meditative experiences, can only go by this hearsay. Now, it wouldn't be sufficient in a court of law for such hearsay to be considered as tangible evidence. But in Buddhism, we're not looking for evidence. We're looking at practice we can do to see for ourselves. Believing no one. The Buddha doesn't even expect us to believe the Buddha. He says, try this and see for yourself. He's not telling us this is how it is. He's telling us that there's suffering. We cannot argue with that. There is no requirement to believe that there is suffering. It is there, evidence in itself. The cause of suffering, we are to identify ourselves, to become free from it. And the path is just this Noble Eightfold Path, this simple way of approaching our day-to-day activities with right view, that of impermanence, unsatisfactoriness, and not self. Even if you're not convinced you've lived a previous life and you came from absolutely nothing into this existence, with the open-mindedness to accept that we cannot know that either, it is enough to say that we haven't determined and probably cannot determine the beginning or the end, neither of ourselves, this we consider to be us, or that even of the universe, as ordinary mortal beings. But it isn't to say that that lack of knowledge is detrimental to the results we can attain through this practice. This practice is so very simple. We can spend hours ploughing through videos on the internet, reading books and listening to interviews and very long and detailed explanations. But is it the answer? No. If a dead man jumps out of his grave and comes to you and say, hey, look, this is what death is like, you can't believe him because he's no longer dead. He's alive, talking to you. He can never do that when he's already dead forever. We can believe there are these phenomena, approaches from other worlds, from other beings. We can spend lifetimes, our lifetime, within this lifetime, researching such things. Now, there is plenty of evidence, yes, of previous lives. These are tangible aspects that have been brought forward into the current life. So, for instance, skills, talents, languages, knowledges that people are born with, which they couldn't possibly have been taught or experienced within this lifetime. But again, that is only proof of something. It isn't ever going to give you proof of nothing. So we can only talk of after that liberated individual dies as to what it isn't. So when a flame goes out, it doesn't go anywhere, it just goes out. But what is it? Can we describe the flame not being there? No. We can describe it's no longer light, it's no longer heat, it's no longer burning oxygen or fuel. It isn't these things. It is no longer there. If you wake in the night and there's a shadow and you think someone's in your room and you're filled with fear, hiding under your bedclothes, and you turn the light on and there's nothing there, where has that being gone? Well, it wasn't there. It isn't there now. You can describe what it isn't and what it was in your imagination. Or if it's real, what it is. But when it's gone, it's gone. You can only just describe what it isn't. So however many times we're asked, where do you go after attaining to Nibbana? What is it? The Buddha's, what's the word? Epitaph, I think? Nickname, Tathagata. He refers to himself as the Tathagata, thus gone. Because he was, and then he wasn't. As we are, and won't be. And this eternal soul, I'm not going to go into the whole detail. You're all talking about the Buddha Moggallana visiting heavens and hells. What vehicle? This is surely the astral body, which for all intents and purposes might as well be the same thing as soul or spirit. No. They are just knowing through an experience, still sensual. We cannot know. They don't say, oh, it was this astral body, I picked it up at the supermarket, it came in 3 sizes, I popped this on and went to heaven or I went to hell. It isn't of such a nature that it can be described, but it isn't this body or that body. Again, we can only tell you what it isn't, or we can only guess what it isn't. But this is a knowledge that they're recollecting. This is a knowledge they're passing on to us of their experience of these realms. But it isn't that important when we have an understanding of the workings of karma, which is the other aspect of right view. We understand the characteristics of this existence, anicca, dukkha, anatta, impermanence, suffering, and not self. That we may have existed in previous lives. and if not free from attachment in this realm, and having not extinguished the cause of suffering, desire, based on these three defilements or kilesas, greed, hatred and delusion, without the eradication of those, the likelihood is we'll be reborn again in some realm or another. But again, we cannot know that. We don't need to know that. We can experience freedom from suffering simply by sitting in meditation. So karma, all of our actions of body, speech and mind have results, good and bad. Good actions result in good things, bad actions in bad things, generally speaking. And this is the other aspect of right view, this understanding. The rest is keeping the precepts, and then there comes meditation. So I'll ask the questioner here, whom's talking of astral bodies and planes and heavens and hells, does anatta actually mean no soul? Was the Buddha talking about no unchanging soul or unchanging personality or essence? No, he wasn't. Everything changes. He's not talking about soul. We've got such a mixture of words there, souls, astrals, this and that. That which knows, our mind, is the most unchanging aspect of our nature. Even the thinking brain, consciousness, will change with changes in perception, with changes in view, with changes in what you like and what you dislike, what you want more of, what you want less of. These aspects also change throughout our lives. But what does not change is what knows that. That we call the citta. A Pali word that's hard to understand or translate into any of our own native tongues. And it's really better just left as that, citta. Or in my language, that which knows. That which knows I'm experiencing pain or suffering, unhappiness, the related and corresponding mental emotion linked with the physical aspect of pain, both suffering, unhappiness and pain, but both linked. But that which knows of those isn't linked. It's observing that you're unhappy and that you're in pain. It may even know that you're unhappy because you're in pain. But with wisdom it will know that even when the pain's gone, there will still be unsatisfactoriness, unhappiness that can occur. And with that wisdom develops equanimity, peace and calm with all experiences that come along. So I think I've covered those two questions with regards to rebirth. But the simple answer is when a flame goes out, it's gone. There's no longer fuel to give us the heat and give us the light. It is no longer burning. It is no longer. But what it is, where it is, cannot be determined. Only what it isn't and where it isn't. So, with regards to this karma and rebirth, there can be no evidence or science to support it. So it begins with, I struggle with the concept of rebirth, as there can be no evidence or science to support it. It is not simply a belief like going to heaven or hell. I'm sorry, but I find the idea... Sorry, I don't need to laugh, it's just you're saying I'm sorry. You don't need to say you're sorry. And I'm sorry, but I find the idea that a child's suffering is getting payback from a previous existence quite abhorrent. Okay, let's begin with the struggle. I struggle with the concept. Don't struggle with it. Let it go, put it down, forget all about it, in other words. It doesn't matter. If you don't want to believe in rebirth, that's because you don't want to believe in it. But if you just don't believe in rebirth, it doesn't matter. Right view will be established with the rest of the practice eventually. When you come to experience evidence of this yourself. There is no evidence or scientific science to support it. Of course there isn't. Because all evidence and science we can come across in this earthly realm, this plane of existence, is based on conditioned things in samsara. And we're not talking about that. There's no mathematical formula. In any religions, in fact, there is no such thing as documentary evidence and proof of heavens, hells, or what happens after death. But the Buddha doesn't give us that. He tells us there's suffering. Now there is evidence of that, which you go on to say about this poor child. Now, I did not actually say it is payback. I said it was perhaps the results of causes and conditions put in place in a previous life, that a child may be born into less fortunate conditions or suffering in this lifetime, whereas other children may not be. Maybe, but we cannot understand the depths and ramifications of karma only in the sense of what we do now. Likewise, it didn't say you just ignore it and say, oh, this child, it just did bad things in the previous life. Of course you don't. You look after, you do all you can do out of your own compassion, kindness, and generosity to help other beings. But all suffering that's going on at the moment in the world, whether it be with children, adults, through violence, through starvation, through sickness, is ultimately as a result of these defilements of greed, hatred and delusion. Lobha, dosa, moha, the Pali words for these kilesas, defilements. Ah, but it's not the child's fault. No, it's not in this lifetime. This is an innocent child, yes. But the suffering is directly as a result of other individuals' greed and hatred and delusion. But we cannot eradicate others' greed, hatred and delusion, only help them to. And the best way to help them to is by beginning with ourselves. Now, if everybody got rid of their own greed, hatred and delusion, all beings on the planet were to do this now, just like that, then of course there would be no suffering, because there's plenty to go round. But that isn't going to happen, hasn't happened in the past, and is unlikely to happen in the future. But you can begin with your own practice, this Noble Eightfold Path, of reducing and eradicating greed, hatred and delusion, and therefore setting an example whereby others will follow you, trying to do the same, and improve their lives substantially by becoming free themselves from those defilements, and therefore, to a degree, free from suffering. Now, even the most suffering individuals, whether they be children or adults, can find some relief from suffering in just that knowledge, in those knowledges of right view, contained therein, right view, of uncertainty and permanence, that there is suffering, this is normal, but it's out of our control. Just that normality alone, that basis, is a sound form of security and if you like, hope, because you've gained that wisdom, that you will become free from this suffering at some point. Now that isn't a wish, a prayer, it is a fact. You mentioned that surely you would have seen some children enduring terrible suffering during your time in India. Can you honestly say that it's because of previous lives? Well, I can honestly say that it's because of previous lives, because everyone's had previous lives. Otherwise you couldn't be here now. But that's just me. You don't have to believe that. So whether it's honest or whether that's an out downright lie, it doesn't matter. There's still suffering. That is the truth. And I've seen suffering not only in India, I've seen terrible suffering in other countries too, including my own, and experienced suffering myself to varying degrees, as well as a very, what might be considered a considerably comfortable, luxurious existence, as I've seen of others. You cannot single out one country like that as saying, there's suffering in India particularly. Because I've also seen amidst suffering, and this all is a matter of perspective, a great deal of happiness amongst some of the financially poorest and perhaps materialistically poorest people on the planet. People that I know, even today, whom have lived through different and difficult times when they could eat more than 3 times a day or something like that, and now are having to eat just twice a day or once a day. Not out of choice like myself, because I know that's sufficient for an ascetic, as a monk, but because it's out of necessity to make enough go round for the family. But they're still very, very, very happy. They're content with little. And I've also seen people with such an abundance of wealth. In fact, I've seen considerably more people with an abundance of wealth who are very, very depressed. Miserable existence and lives, they tell me they have. And this person said this to me, this person did that. And the depth of their suffering seems to be so far much greater. Essentially, all we need is very little. A little food, a little feeling of safety. And that's sufficient to be content. Anything in addition to that is more likely to cause more suffering. Even captured people develop this difficult to understand condition, Stockholm syndrome, I think it's called, whereby you have an attachment to your, what's it called? The person who's captured you. You're the captive, they're the captator, I don't know. Because they're at least being given what they need just to keep living. And it eventually becomes normal. Now, yes, that could be said, well, they're just getting used to it. It's not right. Of course it's not right. But we cannot change that. We can only change ourselves to become part of the overall conditions that affect everything. So, the abuse and neglect by the actions of adults. This is usually the cause of this child's suffering. Of course, the immediate effect of suffering has to be something visible in the current state you're in. It doesn't necessarily just come out of nowhere. Albeit at any time in our lives we can be told, that's it, you've got cancer, a terminal disease, you've 3 years, 3 months, 3 weeks, 3 days to live. That seemingly comes out of nowhere. But it's just the game. Part of aging, sickness, and death. There will always be suffering, yes. Now the karma, the understanding of karma in right view, isn't to just have an excuse, oh, you know, this person's blind. They must have looked at nasty things in a previous life. It isn't that literal. But in Buddhism, we come to understand, not believe, understand through our practice, through meditation, karma and its effects. The actions of our body, speech and mind, its effects, the results of those actions. We call karma and vipaka, vipaka the results. Through meditation we can see that more clearly. Eventually seeing clearly, this is where this word vipassana comes from, all of these aspects helping us to develop right view. So we understand by seeing clearly why there is rebirth. We understand by seeing clearly karma. Not to the depths analytically of how it works. This was one of the achintaya, the questions the Buddha suggested we don't bother trying to work out, like the beginning and the end of everything. You cannot know that in this lifetime. And your head will explode trying to, like an overheating old-fashioned computer or something, trying to calculate it. So don't try. Just know what you can know here and now in the present moment is enough. Things have changed probably within this body and my thinking brain since I sat down a few minutes ago to begin talking, as well as externally. Now, if I went around trying to think of why all of those changes happened, I'd never be able to get up again. You could never finish working all of that out. As we cannot understand why there should be suffering. And in Buddhism, especially where there's no God, singular creator God or devil, that we can blame, it's perhaps even harder. They say, oh, God works in mysterious ways, you know, as an expression, another excuse or something like that, or it's the devil's work. But these aren't facts. The fact of the matter is always the Four Noble Truths. There is suffering. That's it. So someone is really suffering, someone really isn't. That's because there's suffering. The person who isn't really is, or they're going to be. And more so as a result of what they had and then what they lost. Because what is also true is it will be lost. These are facts. These are the evidence. These are the proof. This is the science. Here and now in this present moment. Not in a big book. Not in intellectual, long-winded, very clever questions or explanations or stories, but in what you can see sitting doing nothing within this body of yours and this thinking brain. And I ask you, how much are you doing that every day? Now, I'm not telling everybody off, although maybe I should, because sometimes I think, well, if you've got time to think about all this, worry about all this, be concerned about all this, argue about, after all, whether you're arguing about what the Buddha said, what Jesus said, what Muhammad said, what anyone's said, even in modern times, philosophers, and then even the scientists, and then the politicians. If you're sitting around all day long debating this, arguing with it, how are you ever going to be free from suffering? All you're doing is generating more and more and more, fueling the fire, throwing more ingredients into the pot. A poisonous potion of knowledge, but speculative knowledge, not facts. The only facts are very simple. They don't even need a pot. It can be counted on one hand. Suffering, cause of suffering, end of suffering, path leading to the end of suffering. What do we do about the suffering children in India, as you say? But they're everywhere. We practice the Noble Eightfold Path. And then finally, I'm really jumping through the questions today to cover a lot of questions that are based on the sort of same thing. Someone who's been practicing, this is an email I've received, comes from a disadvantaged background and is studying Buddhism. I realise that I have more experience in negative things than positive ones. Following the practice of the Noble Eightfold Path, I came across the fact that I do not know what to do benevolently. Benevolently. I think that means charitably. That's what I think benevolence means, charity. That's what I'm going to be talking about next. Except for the instructions that I practice at the level of body, speech and mind, what else can I do? Good, besides words and actions. Maybe there are some suttas or books where there are examples that I can develop in myself. Or do I need to come to this myself? So you answer the question yourself in your questions there. Yes, you need to come to this yourself, but the Buddha tells us how. And there are books, the whole Sutta Pitaka is all about that. But just take what he told us in the Dhammacakka Sutta, his first discourse. The Four Noble Truths and the Noble Eightfold Path, as you are doing, yes, incorporate Sila, Samadhi, Panya. There's another list called the Parami, 10 Parami. These are the qualities we develop as a result of this practice, which isn't contained in the lists we normally hear, or the numerical discourses, or even in any of the suttas individually. But they are qualities, these parami mean qualities within ourselves, like truthfulness, kindness, or truthfulness. And the first of these paramis, dana, generosity, are qualities we develop through this practice, because coming to understand the truth of this existence through this practice, keeping moral virtue, practicing meditation, developing wisdom within right view, we know that by doing good things, not only does it help others, it gives us happiness. So what you can do by way of benevolence is just practice that, dana, giving, generosity. And I was delighted a minute ago because just before I sat down I thought, I'm not feeling very positive about talking. I was feeling more, I'd like to just sit now and meditate. But this is the time I ordinarily sit down and share with you that experience, this experience I'm having day to day. And I've disciplined it within my routine that I do that. But it wasn't 100% with generosity that I was sitting down. The generosity of being able to offer the sharing of that experience. But I was very happy because somebody walked by. And I'd put some biscuits aside and some milks and some things like that in a little bag in the hopes that I could give that to someone later, because we don't have much to give. But before noon, we still have the food around, and if it hasn't all been shared out, there are some bits left over. It's lovely if I have some left that I can give to a passerby. And it just so happens, but then before I sat down, I was able to give that. And this is dana. Immediately, I felt light and happy, joyous even. Just that simple action of giving some biscuits and milk to someone, which then made me so enthusiastic and happy about then sharing more Dharma reflections with you. It took it from 90% to 100% back up. The meter was charged up again, like putting coins in the electricity meter. It run down a little bit, probably because I hadn't spoken for a few days. and then you get out of that routine, and then I sit down again, and it comes back very quickly. But giving, and this is benevolence, this is charity, is like putting coins in the meter. So although it's not specified in the Noble Eightfold Path, it comes under right actions, of course, and in terms of offering sharing of experience, and Dharma is right speech. It's not specifically generosity. In fact, it could be the fourth part of the practice, dana, sila, samadhi, panya. Because it goes without saying. That's a quality, as all of the other parami, truthfulness, patience, satya, khanti, also the ability to meditate, samadhi, that's included in those parami, all come as natural qualities that develop from the rest of sila, samadhi, panya. So what you can do there, with just practicing the Noble Eightfold Path, which is the Noble Eightfold Path, so not just very essential and fruitful in itself, is just any act of giving. Even just a smile is good enough to a stranger, or hello, or is there something I can do to help you? Giving a little time to listen to someone, lend them an ear. Puts more coins in the meter, charges you up, gets you 100% again. So I hope you also get that opportunity. You'll find even when, just referring back to that India experience again there, someone mentioned that I've seen suffering in India. Yes, and everywhere I qualified that with. But I've also found that in places like that where I've lived, where there's a lot, seemingly to the outside world, a lot of suffering, not only is there a lot of happiness, there is the most kindness and generosity. Because everyone has something they can give, even if it's a smile, or a grain of rice, or a teaspoonful of rice. Because they recognize that that is the easiest route to happiness, is giving, dana. So on that note, I shall leave you with those points for some consideration, and hope there is something useful there for you that you can share with others too by way of giving, and benefit from that likewise. Until next time, be happy and stay well. Sukhi Hotu.